Pulls up for three. Boom! Knocks it down.
Curry from the corner at three. Puts it in.
For overtime. Makes it. Garrett. Right.
Welcome to the latest edition of the MVP Cast with me, Mark Woods, and today we're out and about in a very select 5-star hotel with a pianist in the background, which you might be able to hear, down in London, where the NBA game is on this week. The great and the good of European basketball here, and perhaps the most influential British figure in the world of basketball, joining us in this week's edition, Ed Scott, the Chief Operations Officer, I think is the correct title that he has these days, joining us this time. And Ed, welcome to the MVP Cast.
Thank you very much, Mark. I think it's important to note that we're in this hotel, but none of us are actually sleeping in this hotel. So we're just here taking advantage of their lobby services. But thanks a lot for the welcome.
I'm sure you're in a better hotel than I am. Anyway, you are currently the Brit who is in the biggest position within the basketball firm. And I mean, you had a very interesting sort of background. You grew up in Sussex, Surrey?
West Sussex. Yep.
And then, because you went to university in Surrey, you spent a little bit of time at Basketball England. You survived unscathed, which is quite admirable for anyone, and then made your way through certain parts of the basketball universe. Talk about that journey. How did you get to the position where effectively you're second, I think we can fairly say, is in command at Euroleague basketball?
Well, thanks again for the unnecessary praise. The journey pretty much began as a child because my mother is from Catalonia in Spain. We would go on an biannual basis to visit the family in Spain, and so that's where the basketball bug bit me from a very young age, in terms of getting emotionally invested in the sport of basketball. In the 80s, 90s, basketball in Spain was already very high profile, it was already very followed. And so despite the fact that the, let's say, traditional school holidays is downtime for the official competitions, for the ACB League, in this case, I was still exposed sufficiently to where, like I said, I was bit by the basketball bug and fell in love with the sport. So that was the beginning, that was the seed that was first planted, and obviously, joking aside, back in the UK, it wasn't really possible to feed that desire, to feed that passion, whether it was playing, so my local club in Crawley, in youth basketball, I'd practice, 1 hour a week. In my school, we never had a full-size basketball court in terms of indoors, so we'd struggle to scrabble together enough kids who would have a minimum interest or understanding of the sport of basketball to actually play a small number of games. And in addition to that, I was never that good anyway, to be perfectly frank. So whilst I tried hard and attempted to improve, I knew I was never going to be a player. But because of the passion in the sport, from a very young age, I started getting involved in coaching, which was, again, the genuine passion in the sport. Volunteering at school, volunteering in my local club at Crawley, and gradually getting more and more involved in the sport. So taking England basketball at the time it was called, basketball coaching awards, level 1, 2, 3. In parallel, doing some officiating. So again, getting a couple of grade 3 referee was called back then, and doing some officiating here and there. Volunteering club management, so volunteering in events, helping out, chairing my club at a reasonably young age, just through the passion to try and contribute and help and support however possible. And that carried on over the years. So I kind of had a dual path, going to university, studying electronic engineering, working in what I still call the real world, with real jobs and real people, and in parallel I had this basketball passion going on. So at the time I was also fortunate enough to volunteer down at the Worthing Thunder when they were in, again, NBL Division 1, so second level behind the BBL back then, as an example. And also, perhaps one of the key points for me was I was lucky enough, so it sounds actually a bit macabre when I say it, but when 9/11 happened in September 2011, I was in my first year studying at the University of Surrey. And so obviously that had quite an impact on the world level and on travel, on security, and on people's perception of the US. And I was very, very keen to try and spend some time studying abroad, whether it was Spain, the US, somewhere to expand, let's say, the horizons and to have a different experience. And my university, the University of Surrey, had a partnership with 5 different universities in the US. And because of 9/11, nobody wanted to go. And either I was stupid, innocent, innocuous, or all of the above, but I was incredibly keen on going and thought it was a great opportunity. And so I applied, and my grades were good enough, and like I said, the low turnout, maybe also helped. You never know in hindsight. But spending 1 year in the US at Michigan State University exposed me to college basketball. So picturing the scene 2002 in the UK, if NBA, let's say, basketball or European basketball had a limited exposure historically, back then, the internet was only really starting to take off properly, and UK or European-based media didn't really cover college basketball. So I went, pretty much with open arms and open eyes, but oblivious to the standard of collegiate basketball, of NCAA and Division I sports, and was basically blown away at what I saw. And again, I was very lucky that I was studying, so I was taking master's level courses in electronic engineering, but in parallel I had a chance to volunteer, in this case with the women's basketball team at Michigan State University. And again, the men had just come back off 3 straight years of the NCAA Final Four, 2000 national champions, so they were oversubscribed, which was a blessing in disguise, because I was able to volunteer and help out with the women's team, who are much less popular, proportionally speaking. But being in a program where we were averaging about 6,500 fans per game in a 15,000 seat arena, we had a dedicated practice court 24/7. We had 4 full-time coaches, full-time secretary, part-time strength and conditioning coach, part-time academic advisor, part-time athletic trainer. So the resources around the program were absolutely unbelievable. We traveled in charter flights to all of our destinations, and it really was just an incredible experience, which also in the back of my mind helped me decide, okay, if I can, I'd like to try and work in the sport of basketball if possible, and if not, as a backup, we can always go back to what I continue calling the real world, and use my electronic engineering degree for a real purpose. So that's the not so short version of my background. And then, as you said, I was lucky enough to get an opportunity to join England basketball in 2004. Work for Keith Mayer, who was an inspiration, and work on one of the few international events, the Under-16 Boys Division B, which we hosted down in Burgess Hill at the Triangle, which is a curious facility when we talk about European events or multinational sort of teams, but at the time that was the reality, and that was what was possible. So again, that coincided. That was the generation of Dan Clark, Matthew Bryan Ammoning. So like so many times in the basketball history in the UK, you saw glimpses of potential. Back then, before that, now as well. So unfortunately, over the years, I've been out of the UK, and I've not been able to continue to be involved hands-on or directly in the sport in this country, but let's say the passion or the will and the interest is still there. And
how much, when you look at being involved in something like Worthing Thunder, small-time basketball in the whole scheme of things, then you go to a college, and obviously it's big operations, big venues, national TV, but how much of that is scalable, do you think, in terms of the issues and the challenges and the opportunities and the way that you go about things? I mean, were you able to, in that small learning stage, take lessons from one going to the other?
Well, I'm a firm believer that we learn on a daily, hourly, minute by minute basis from all of our experiences, and so sometimes we learn best practices that are directly applicable somewhere else. Sometimes I think we learn best practices that you have to adjust to market, or let's say reality to reality. But ever since I started talking specifically about basketball, ever since I started getting involved, playing or coaching, volunteering, and so on, I've also learned a lot, learning what not to do. And whilst I shan't name any names, I think it's also good to learn when you experience or when you participate in something and you don't think it's the best way, or you think there's a better way to do it. It's an important learning point to kind of file away in the back of your memory of, well, if I ever get an opportunity to coach, for example, I would do this or I would do that, or I'd copy this or copy that, and I would attempt to find a different way to do something else, whether we're talking about man management, whether we're talking about practice planning, whether we're talking about communication, with players or with ownership, and again across all the levels. Obviously now for many years I've been involved in administration, so I think it's also I on a daily basis I use things that I learned from coaching, because some of them are transferable skills and some of them are applicable in situations you find out in management and administration. And I think if I ever had the opportunity in the future to go back into coaching, I definitely would hope or would like to think that I would be in a better position or able to have more success because of the things that I have and continue to learn on the management sort of administration side of things.
We've not been at Euroleague for 12 years, which is quite extraordinary because we were both quite young when you went there. I remember when you just started at it, and it doesn't seem that long ago, but as our time moves on. But you rock up there, and you're a guy coming from this country. Was there any kind of perception challenge you had to overcome? Okay, you speak Catalan, that kind of helps, but you're coming in there, do people kind of go, you're from Britain, what do you know about basketball, even back then?
They said it back then, and they say it today as well. So that has not changed one iota. But no, I mean, joking aside, I think there's not only a perception, but there's a reality that the relative, let's say, knowledge or the relative expertise in the sport in this country is limited. I think it's inversely proportional to, let's say, the perception of football. So when a Brit goes anywhere in the world, I've got friends that are involved in football coaching or administration, in New Zealand, in the US, and places like that, and when they land there, they benefit, let's say, from the opposite perception or from the opposite perspective from day one. But I think like anyone and like any situation, over time you either prove that you do know or you have an idea of what you're talking about and what you're attempting to do and the decisions that you're contributing to, or you don't. And if you don't, then obviously you one way or another you're either politely asked to move on, or you're forcefully told to move on, or you yourself realize that you're not contributing, you're not adding value, and so it's time to look for another project. I think actually, ironically, inside Euroleague basketball now we currently have 4 Brits, so including Richard Stokes heading up our officiating area, which is a technical position, so it's a basketball operations, sports expertise area. So it's ironic that the 2 of us are there, and then we have another couple of British colleagues that are in our marketing side of the company. But something that I never get tired of telling people when they ask this kind of question is, over time and over many different organisations, I think the nationality on the passport, or let's say the city or country of birth or upbringing, is increasingly more anecdotal, versus what that person's experiences have been, what that person's studies have been in that sense. I mean, when I was in the US, it was identical. There I was in the performance, coaching side and role. And again, if in Europe, let's say, the perception of British basketball is not so high, in the US it's even lower, to be honest. But I think in the US, culturally or socially, people are not so prejudiced or are not so judgmental. And so let's say on first appearances, it's anecdotal that you're from one country or another, but immediately after that, it's okay. What have you studied? What courses have you taken? What clinics have you attended? What videos have you reviewed? What coaches have you gone to watch practice? What teams have you been with? So where are you today as a sort of global individual or your global philosophy or approach? More so than you've got a funny accent, and when you go back home, you always have afternoon tea with the Queen, and
obviously we all do.
Well, obviously we all do, and the stigma of British people, British guys in the US, have a lot of success with the girls because of the accent. I had tons of 50 and 60-year-old women that would swoon when I was ordering food in a cafe or restaurant. But beyond that, it's the stereotypes kind of end about there, I think.
Coming into Euroleague, and then the league has morphed slightly over the years in terms of amount of teams and the way that those teams are entered into the competition, etc. But where do you think the league sits now in relation to 12 years ago in terms of what it wants to achieve and what it's actually managing to achieve?
Well, I think on a personal level, I consider myself incredibly fortunate to have lived or to have experienced from the inside the growth and development of our organisation from 2006 until today. When I joined, the project was 6 years old. It was 1 year. It'd come off only just opening our own, let's say, commercial in-house team 1 year previously, and so from a maturity perspective, let's say it was still quite a young, let's say politically, influenced organisation or politically driven organisation, but that was setting the seeds and setting the groundwork to take off in terms of success, whether we talk about business numbers, whether we talk about audience outreach, whether we talk about the quality of the teams, on or off the court, branding, marketing, positioning, all those things. And I think from that period, from 2006, 2009, 2012, those kind of periods, our in-house commercial team, basically got themselves settled and got, very actively into the marketplace and selling rights and like I said, promoting the competition, communicating the competition. And then in more recent years, we've evolved and again, I'd say we've improved with, for example, the most recent agreement with IMG and the 10-year joint venture that our clubs have signed and that we're 2.5 years into right now. To basically really bring the focus and the priority much more on the business side of things and much more on making strategic decisions that are for the benefit of our fans and for the benefit of growing and expanding the sport in our primary markets in the European territory. And so if I have to compare, for example, the senior management meetings or the club, the owner meetings that we have today compared to 12 years ago, so 12 years ago, I wasn't fortunate enough to sit in on the meetings, but I have access to the minutes of all of them and I've read them at length, and so we've basically changed radically. Where 12 years ago we would talk about, let's say, sports politics, we would talk about balancing interests, we would talk about domestic leagues, national federations, and so the core, let's say, time and energy spent would be those kind of, let's say, topics. And our most recent Echo shareholders executive board meeting at the end of November in Tel Aviv that we had, those topics were almost an afterthought at the end of the right at the end of the agenda, right at the end of the meeting, and the rest of the 3 hours were spent discussing strategy, how to grow the brands of the clubs, how to grow the brand of the league, how to reach a wider audience, how to connect with millennials, how to apply a grassroots program successfully so that we attract kids, boys and girls who have never been exposed or have very little knowledge of basketball before, etc. And so and everything that we're doing, so that same month of November, we took the main decision makers, the main business chief business officers in the top Euroleague clubs to New York for a week, and we toured them around a bunch of American football, baseball, ice hockey, soccer as they call it over there, and basketball facilities, to meet with personnel from clubs, to meet with personnel from leagues, and to meet with personnel from the venues themselves to basically show best practices in fan experience. So best practices in how do you take care of fans, how do you engage with fans, how do you have them have the best possible experience from leaving their house or their place of work all the way through to getting back home post game, and how here in Europe we can learn a lot from North America and from those best practices. And that really, responds to your question earlier about there are different levels, there are different business levels, there are different audience, let's say, levels, and talking about a sport like American football in the US is the number one sport in the market. Well, that's equivalent to basketball in Lithuania. But when we talk about basketball in Germany, unfortunately, it's not the number one sport. It's not the number two sport. It's working. We're all working hard to increase it so that it's closer to that point. But obviously, some of the best case practices you have to adjust and you have to modify based on your local market conditions. So, and that really, I think, is the evolution or change that we've had inside Euroleague basketball and inside our clubs. Therefore, over that 12-year period.
Based on feedback, what do you think the biggest thing that those clubs that went in Europe took in terms of that's something we hadn't thought of, or that's something we should be a lot stronger in?
I wouldn't say that's something we haven't thought of, because the reality is in our sector, in the sports, entertainment, sports business sector, there's, except for really innovative technology, there's nothing radical which no one's ever done before, which no one's ever thought about before. So most things are about applying best practices in across the business or across the sport from top to bottom. So I think one of the key takeaways that our clubs had from that trip was the North American clubs do not base their strategy, do not base their business, do not base their marketing plans around will the team be successful this season, will we make the playoffs, will we win the championship. They all have very, very clear goals and very, very clear KPIs, very, very clear metrics they want to achieve based on the previous season, based on the average in their league, in their respective sport, based on areas where they can improve, that are all completely independent from what happens on the court, on the pitch, on the field, in that sense, on the ice. And that's something that we've spent years sharing that with our clubs and talking with the owners of clubs and working with the marketing and communications and sales teams from clubs to culturally, let's say, make that adaptation here in Europe. And it's something that it's a work in progress, it's a long process to achieve that. And let's say Europe should never ever lose its essence. So in Europe we have more passionate fans, we have more tribal fans, we have more emotion, let's say, surrounding the sports, and more emotion regarding to the connection that fans have with their teams and so on, which we should never lose sight of that, and we should never, let's say, eliminate that. But those are the type of things that in North America are, they're secondary, they're incidental sort of thoughts in the business area, and for example, one of the things that our owners 18 months ago decided in the latest 5-year strategic plan is the staffing inside clubs. There has to be, like there has always been, a general manager who's responsible for the Barcelona operations, for hiring, recruiting players, the strategy of the youth program, the coaching staff, etc., etc. So that's mature, that's stable, that's working, and so on. So obviously it can improve always, but it's in place with the medical team and sports science and whatever, performance analysis. But on the business side, our clubs must have a decision maker who is as senior as the general manager, who has a business team reporting to him or her, and that they are making decisions in order to improve and grow the club and grow the club's activity and the club's reach and the club's audience and ultimately the club's revenues in that sense as a focus point. So
how difficult is that to implement when you've got 16 teams? Obviously you've moved slightly more to a closed franchise era, so you've got some big clubs who are there every year, the Real Madrids, the CSKA Moscows, the FC Barcelona's, proven infrastructure, I guess, there. And then you've got at the other end smaller teams who have come through, Podgorica and Montenegro, I suppose, being the example, that from the outside don't look as if they could scale the same kind of heights, nor should anyone expect them to. So how do you achieve some kind of balance, even if it's off the court, between those big names and the so-called smaller franchises?
Well, I mean, that's a great question, Mark. when people discuss this topic and when they're talking about the North American sort of major leagues, everyone's thoughts, I think, immediately go to, you have a salary cap, you have a draft system, so you have, let's say, tools or mechanisms that attempt, because let's be honest, you can never guarantee competitive parity in any system from top to bottom, but they attempt to at least give everyone the same opportunity, allow the teams who have expiring contracts or weaker players to get stronger players, theoretically avoid the accumulation of stars, and all stars in one team. I'm always emphasising theoretically, because the practical applications is, and especially when you've got soft caps instead of hard caps, are not the same. But all of that is on the, let's say, sports side, on the basketball operation side in our sport. In Europe, in our competitions, and in football competitions, we don't have salary caps. There's obviously complex reasons in terms of legal jurisdictions, in terms of multiple countries, in terms of tax differences, and so on. That why that's being studied, and in the future, it's a topic that's, let's say, constantly on the table, and that we're constantly evaluating internally. But to apply something like that on a pan-European scale is complex, and really has to be studied and applied in, let's say, in a very good way to work. But on the business side, what I think is not so common, or not so much at the forefront of people's minds when they're talking about competitive parity, when you talk about the North American major leagues, there is absolutely no parity whatsoever on the business side, because taking our sport, taking the NBA as a practical example, the two teams in New York or the two teams in LA, they will always have a massive advantage from the business perspective over the Oklahoma City Thunder, over the Charlotte Hornets, over the Portland Trailblazers, purely because the local market opportunities that they have, being in the New York metropolitan area, or being in the Los Angeles metropolitan area, gives you access to a much larger population, gives you access to much more businesses in the region, gives you access to wealthier individuals, gives you access to larger media markets with all the direct and indirect opportunities that provide. So gives you access to much wider tourism numbers of people that can come and spend or buy or follow your team, or you buy your merchandise or whatever it may be. And therefore that's a human, let's say, social, geopolitical reality that will always be the case. So FC Barcelona or Real Madrid on the business side of things, will never ever have parity with Budućnost Voli Podgorica, one's a 45 million population country, and the capital city in the case of Madrid, and Montenegro is a country of 600,000 people, with much lower GDP, much lower purchasing power, and so on. So, in that sense, our focus on the business area is not so much obtaining or achieving parity from city to city, market to market, club to club, because we know that's never practically feasible. But it's more about each of those clubs individually in their respective markets doing a much better job of maximizing the potential they have, maximizing their revenues, minimizing the need for shareholder contributions. So essentially, continuously becoming more profitable, a more stable, and a more balanced, business in that respect.
You've got a handful of football clubs owning Euroleague teams at the moment, and split into different categories. FC Barcelona, Real Madrid essentially use this as a brand extension. Top level, obviously want to win, obviously would like to make term profits on it, but it's not a priority. You've got Bayern Munich, who very much run as a very sensible business. The football club doesn't inject a huge amount of cash into it over and above its brand name and associations. When you look at British football teams looking to grow their businesses, and obviously it's probably maxed out in terms of the revenues they can have, maybe apart from overseas TV shares, but if a Chelsea or a Man United came to you, would you say to them, yes, there's a viable proposition here, or what might they get out of this if they thought, if we built a team, went into the Euroleague, we could make this a success?
Well, answering the question, in our opinion, it's applicable in the British, English, markets as it is in other markets as well. we currently have, you very accurately described, different ownership and different governance models. So the two Spanish clubs, like you said, follow a similar model. In Bayern Munich, they have a completely independent company, completely independent accounting between the basketball section and the football section. So therefore, there's no contribution, like you said, beyond the brand and beyond the fan base and obviously the added value that does provide. With our Greek clubs, Olympiacos and Panathinaikos, it's completely independent companies from the football club, so they're different owners altogether, which is therefore again different to Bayern Munich. In Turkey, the clubs like Fenerbahce or Galatasaray have another difference in terms of how they're set up. So, or for example, CSKA Moscow again is another variety. So we don't really have a template, or we don't have a, let's say, one size fits all solution. But if we were talking hypothetically about a Man United, a Chelsea, being interested in this kind of proposition, the model to follow, would definitely be the Bayern Munich model. So it's our firm belief that that it's necessary to, again, hypothetically, creating or starting up a basketball section from scratch in the UK. If it's approached as a separate entity from a company, let's say, accounting perspective, that is necessary to set from day one, to set the bar high in terms of having a sustainable business model. So it's in none of our interests to artificially create or to artificially support a business model that's not sustainable over time, because over the course of time it inevitably will lead to failure, and that's unnecessary to start from that point from day one. And where the Euroleague competition is today compared to several years ago, it's also a completely different value proposition for hypothetically Man U or Chelsea, because, and I'm using the names purely because you've used them, there's no preference, or there's no conversations, or there's no let's say concrete leads anywhere at the moment to comment on. But the value proposition for those clubs now, from next season onwards, it would be to join a competition where they have 17 guaranteed home dates from October through to April, which allows someone to put together a serious business plan. You're guaranteed to compete against the top elite premium products across Europe on a weekly basis. There's stability inside a 10-year joint venture with IMG that provides minimum guaranteed revenues and minimum guaranteed investment for the league as a whole. And for those clubs that work well, it's an opportunity to extend the brand and extend the outreach. And Bayern Munich is one of many, let's say, examples towards something else. You made reference, Mark, to perhaps some of the Premier League clubs are already, let's say, saturated in their marketplace, and perhaps they already may have reached or are close to reaching their ceiling. So the English Premier League, under Richard Scudamore's leadership, back in the 90s, were very smart, because they were the first ones that really said, okay, if we want to grow, let's not just look at what we're doing, let's not just look at our stadia, let's not just look at domestic TV rights, but let's go east. And so for years, Premier League clubs were doing pre-season tours in East Asia, and in the beginning it was an investment, because they would lose money on those tours back then, but several years later, you see now that the positioning of those Premier League brands in Thailand, in Singapore, in Indonesia, in Japan, in China, and so on, the English football clubs have much bigger followings and have much more, let's say, fan passion than, let's say, their competitors in the European marketplace, for example, or in Latin America, or wherever it may be, because they got there first, and because they invested, and they stayed the course over time, and they've built something over time. And so the Premier League global rights now, in terms of media rights, is a very significant proportion of their income, and is still growing at the moment. So the basketball proposition, the basketball opportunity, I think gives them an opportunity to provide, let's say, a different experience for fans on the ground. So in London, how much money does it cost to go and watch Chelsea play now, and how many people can go and do that on a weekly basis, in the Premier League or in the European competition. And so if they were to have an elite basketball team, it gives them an opportunity to offer a different product to their fans. Basketball has a different demographic. Basketball has much more urban connectivity, and so therefore, ironically, and I don't think it's that well known in the UK, but many, for example, London-based Premier League clubs already have basketball projects, but their outreach projects, their school projects, their community projects, because they know that basketball is so popular from a participation level in so many important key neighbourhoods inside London. And they're already doing that, organically. So they're doing that, let's say, without anyone from, British basketball, from Basketball England, from elsewhere, let's say, pushing or selling, let's say, and marketing that to them. But they already realise that there's added value there. So obviously, I also come at it from a very biased perspective because, it would also hypothetically bring added value to the existing clubs that are inside, Euroleague basketball and they're playing the Euroleague competition. So, in our opinion, it would be a sort of win-win formula or a win-win equation. But between now and that, let's say, hypothetically happening, there's obviously a lot of work that would need to be put in as well, down the road. So.
Frivolous question since the NBA's in town. One of my favourite pre-season entities was Euroleague against the USA, because occasionally Euroleague wins, and that's kind of fun in a way, just to show the NBA can be beaten at times. But not seen that much of that the last few years. Is that going to come back? Have you guys had any talks about how that might be extended, grown? Because we see even the International Club Cup, of course, does involve Euroleague or the NBA at the moment, but we've always kind of wanted maybe a World Club title. What sort of situation is that at right now?
Well, obviously back in the 80s and 90s, the McDonald's Open was a great event for those of us who are sort of basketball junkies. That was run for a few years and then unfortunately was discontinued. And so in 2006, we had the opportunity, together with the NBA, to bring back something pseudo, similar, obviously only involving European and NBA teams, but with the NBA Europe Live project, which that year we had 4 NBA teams hold training camps in 4 different European cities, and then play multiple friendly games, and then have a final phase of sort of the winners, in Cologne in Germany, and so. And that lasted for several years in different formats. But unfortunately, in recent years, the respective calendars of each competition have evolved slightly. So the NBA have, moved forward their starting date in order to reduce the ratio, the frequency of games during the regular season, responding to requests from their players in terms of player health, in terms of rest and recovery, in terms of intensity of their schedule. In parallel with that, they've also brought forward the start of their training camps. They've reduced the duration of their training camps. They've reduced the number of exhibition games played during the preseason. And all of that has been without changing their competition system at all. So this is with maintaining throughout their 82 game regular season and playoffs and so on. Then on the European side, the Euroleague and Euro Cup calendars they have evolved in recent years, with including competition system changes, and the fact that next season the Euroleague will be an 18-team round robin league. The Euro Cup, is in its 24-team format, which will remain, for the past couple of seasons, has already started sort of 3rd, 4th of October. On our side, and so unfortunately every year, let's say, with both of these evolutions, the window of opportunity for these games to take place is ever decreasing. So in the short or mid-term, it's not that likely that we'll be able to make things work. With the NBA teams having shorter training camps, they're also less keen on flying across several time zones to come to Europe, to stay for a few days and then fly back, because they lose a couple of days, and with jet lag and so on, the players are not exactly practicing how they would be otherwise. And the other thing we shouldn't forget is, it was good fun when Barcelona would beat the Lakers in an October preseason game, The difference being that in early October, Barcelona have had several weeks of preseason training. Their rosters together. They know where they are. Whilst the NBA, still have 20. The Lakers are carrying 20 guys because they're still deciding who to cut, who to keep, and so on. And the main stars aren't playing that many minutes. So it's so it was fun, and we enjoyed it. I think the NBA, and their teams enjoyed it as well. But I think short midterm, we'll probably hopefully be looking to do some different things, and unfortunately, it's not so likely we'll be able to have those exhibition games in Europe.
At times, the McDonald's Open was just splendid. They should really bring that back at some point. A frivolous, parochial topic to finish up with. Your boss, Jordi Bertomeu, again said recently, we'd love to have a EuroLeague team in Europe. There's probably a building there that could host it. What would it take for a British team to be back in the EuroLeague? I mean, it may, as he suggested, not even be a BBL team playing domestically, but a standalone EuroLeague franchise. What is needed? Even looking from the outside from Spain, but looking at the business model, what would it take to make that kind of a idea a reality?
Well, I think Jordi equally learns from the best, and David Stern on many occasions said, in 10 years' time we're going to have an NBA team in Europe, and it was David's way of having a bit of fun with the media out here in Europe, I think, and so there's obviously an element of truth and an element of sort of aspirational or dream to Jordi's recent statements, but I think they're also nothing new. So in 2000, when Euroleague Barca was created. For the first couple of seasons, we had the London Towers playing out of Crystal Palace in the competition, and so, back then Rick Taylor, Kostis Manakis, the goal from year one, or the vision from year one, was we'd like to have this market, we'd like to have the UK, inside the EuroLeague and the Euro Cup, and over the years, obviously, in the EuroLeague we haven't seen any British clubs. We've seen the Brighton Bears are in the Euro Cup. We've seen the Guildford Heat in their former setup, in the Euro Cup back then, as it was called. But I think the reality today is that the standard and the demands of the EuroLeague and Euro Cup have evolved and have increased over time. And so, it's probably even further away from the BBL average than it was some years ago. And that in no way is a sort of judgmental statement. It's just the EuroLeague this season, for example, the average club budgets in terms of their operations, this year are about 22 million euros per club, and so on the playing staff side, you're talking about approximately on average 2/3 of that. So when you compare that to the BBL salary cap of a couple of £100,000, for the whole team. That's it's a number. It's an objective data. It's an objective metric. It's not it's not an opinion. So I think the key point is in the UK we have some great facilities. So in London there's some decent arenas, but there's decent arenas in Manchester. There's nowadays there's decent arenas in Leeds, in Sheffield, in Scotland as well, in Glasgow. So there's a lot of facilities around the country. So that that's in place. The market's in place. The size of the market's in place. If there were hypothetically to be one EuroLeague club, it would be one in the whole market. So you could make a marketing and promotional PR case of trying to get let's say in inverted commas the country or the extended population behind that team. Depending obviously on the branding on the club, if it was associated to an existing fan base or if it was something new and so on. And so really the missing piece or the missing element, and it's very, let's say, unemotional to say this, but is cash. So in order to compete at the highest level in basketball, like I said, the average budget at the moment is 22 million euros, and because the UK market, the local costs and the cost of living and so on here, and thanks to the incredibly smart people who work in the Houses of Parliament, in the near future, that will probably only increase, and there'll probably be only more complexities and more challenges, depending on how that evolves. So it means that to be competitive at the EuroLeague level, it would have to be in the region or in the range of the average, but perhaps even higher, because you have to compensate for those local, sort of market cost differences, and you have to compensate from the fact that, again, whether we like it or not, the average standard of the average local player is not the same as in a Lithuania or in a Serbia or in a Greece, where for a relatively smaller salary you can have high-level, competitive, experienced players. And here in the UK, unfortunately, it would be the opposite. So therefore, the main key really is resource generation. So, we would need a club that is that is well funded and that is well resourced, and like I said, that is ready to be competitive on and off the court, at the European level.
You must be really glad you've got a Spanish passport as well.
Well, ironically, I don't. So
I'm sure you'll be getting it soon.
No. I have one British one, and I'm in the process of getting an Irish one. So my Irish grandparents, one of the many legacies that they've left is that my father, my brother, myself, hopefully, will won't have to suffer at the hands of the intellectuals, at 10 Downing Street, excessively. So.
I might not be far behind you. The form's on my desk at the minute unfilled. Anyway, Ed Scott, in this beautiful surroundings here in Park Lane, London, thank you very much for joining the MVP cast, and continued success over at Euroleague.
Thank you very much, Mark. Regards to all the listeners, and let's talk soon.
That's it for this edition of the MVP Cast. You can download all our previous editions on your favourite podcast providers, or you can head to mvp247.com to get all those past editions. We'll be back with another edition soon, but from me, Mark Woods, it's bye for now.